All right, welcome back from spring break, everyone. We are going to pick up here with 7th century prophets, and to give you a little reprieve this week, hopefully a little bit of grace zone for the upcoming Friday assignment with the QEP activity. That's your research project. The argumentation template is coming due. So to carve a little bit of space into your week, what I'm going to do is move our discussion of Habakkuk to next week. So if you're certainly entitled to submit it this week. If you've already started working on it, that's fine. It'll be graded appropriately, and you won't, have any points taken off. Don't worry about that. But if you want to wait until next week, that's fine. We'll pick up with Habakkuk next week, and then resume with the normally scheduled books according to the course syllabus. So today we're going to talk about the 7th century prophets Nahum, and then we'll finish with Zephaniah. And both of these prophets are oftentimes misunderstood and ignored completely in our churches and Sunday school classes, and most people don't have the foggiest idea what to do with them. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background and locate these books in their historical context, and then what I want to do is dive into the text and hop along the way. We won't cover every verse. I wish we could, but I want to cover some text and illustrate to you and demonstrate how these prophets were not only in tune with the Word, that is their Old Testament. They were very knowledgeable of the Pentateuch, for example, and quote it and allude to it all over the place in their message. But then also just increase the awareness of how aware they were of their political and, you might say, in their national context, what was going on in the world around them, how aware they were of God's agenda for the nations, for example. So we will pick up with the prophet Nahum first, then we'll move to Zephaniah, and then you can do your theological journaling for Friday on just those two books, and then for the rest of your efforts into finishing up your argumentation template that will also be due on Friday for the QEP. All right, that's Module 4, I believe. So we've done our thesis statement, Module 3. Now we're on to Module 4. All right. Probably the big idea for the 7th century prophets. You have to understand these come after the 8th century prophets, of course. And by the time we get to the 7th century, we've already seen the fall of Samaria at the hands of the Syrians in 722 BC. And the prophets Amos, Hosea, Jonah, and Isaiah were all addressing those situations for Israel in the north. The idea that God had raised up the Assyrians and allowed a whole nation, Judah's brother to the north, to go into exile was a shock, especially with regards to, well, what about these unconditional everlasting promises? Let's read our Bible, Genesis 12:1 through 3. What did God promise to Abraham? I mean, has he given up on us? I mean, I thought this land was ours forever and ever, amen. So you've got these prophets in the 7th century that had a hard message to convey and get across to their hard-hearted audience, who had a lot of spiritual pride and in their own mind and heart seemed to have their spiritual act together. So they weren't really, the majority of them anyway, weren't really willing and able to change their spiritual routine anytime soon. So here he is, prominently displayed. Probably the big, crisis for Judah in the south, especially the faithful remnant, was the Sennacherib crisis. And about 20 years after the fall of Samaria, you've got Sennacherib, who's actively pursuing all destinations south. Of course, the big fish was Egypt, and that will eventually come to play out. But Sennacherib is threatening the northern border cities of Judah, and this is called the Sennacherib crisis. I'll let you read this, the Sennacherib prism, which is an archaeological extra-biblical reference to King Hezekiah, and you can see it in the small print there. The famous reference there, he himself I made prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. That's a reference to King Hezekiah. So Sennacherib knew very well what he was doing, and we've covered a little bit of that when we talked about Isaiah, and last semester in the survey course we talked about the Sennacherib crisis. And eventually Sennacherib gets routed, his army. He flees back to Nineveh, and he ends up being killed and assassinated by some of his own family members. And that's what happens with the Sennacherib crisis. We also know that King Hezekiah was also involved in preparing for what he thought would be a long siege with the Siloam Tunnel underneath the city, pictured here, as well as, and that's me, no, I'm just kidding, the reinforced city walls. If you go over there, you can see the reinforced city walls. Of course, Isaiah had some things to say about that with regards to King Hezekiah and the fact that the stones from these walls came from the poor homes in and around Jerusalem. So Isaiah addressed Hezekiah's lack of trust in the Lord at that time. Of course, Hezekiah eventually came around and trusted in the Lord, and that led to the change of circumstances. After Hezekiah, we've got Manasseh, who is his son, and unlike his dad, Hezekiah turned 180 degrees and really intensified the real threat against Judah, and that was the spiritual threat. So we go from Sennacherib to Esarhaddon to Ashurbanipal, and we've got Ashurbanipal coming down and wanting the big fish Egypt, and we have Manasseh, the king in Judah, paying tribute. According to the words here, you can see all of the kings listed here. Manasseh is one of them, according to Esarhaddon anyway, before we get to Ashurbanipal. But that's, in Manasseh's eyes, the way to deal with the ongoing Assyrian threat to the north, is that is to pay them tribute. So here we have the records of Ashurbanipal, and we have continuing reference here to kings that are listed here. Manasseh is one of them, who was one who contributed resources to Ashurbanipal, as Ashurbanipal is around destroying and taking on Egypt to the south. So right on top of Ashurbanipal and King Manasseh paying tributes to the kings of Assyria and all of these kinds of activities, we plop Nahum, the prophet, right down in the middle of all of this spiritual chaos and political chaos. Now, let's just think about this. What kind of position do you think that put Nahum? Of course, Nahum comes from the north. He would have probably witnessed some of the brutal tactics of the Assyrians who took out Israel. If Nahum grew up seeing that, now he's got a message from the Lord where he's called to preach basically not only a politically incorrect message, even more than that. His message is a flat out, I guess it would be, Nahum's message, as I was trying to think of the word, is flat out treason. So like the picture here, I think of Nahum as a fugitive. He's got no friends and no allies in the north, any of the leftover villages, unconquered territories. The Assyrians have basically taken up residence in what was formerly known as Israel. So he can't hang out there, and if he goes down to Judah, Manasseh is going to be on his back if he's around preaching anti-Assyria messages to the folks in Jerusalem. So wherever he goes, Nahum's a fugitive. So we move on in history, and from Manasseh we go to his son Ammon, and as we know, Ammon is he's only at the reign for 2 years as a king. He's assassinated by a group from his own servants. And then we have a reference in 2 Kings 21:24, the reference to the people of the land who basically clear the house of Ammon. They take one of Ammon's own sons, 8 years old, Josiah, puts him on the throne. Now what we know very little from about the people of the land, but like the people in this picture, we probably know they were aligned with the seemingly biblical or covenantal principles. They were wanting to preserve the Davidic line politically in terms of the kings and the successors in Judah. So they probably would also be about spiritual reform. And it's interesting, at the age of 16, we read in 2 Chronicles 34:4 that Josiah began to seek after the God of his father David. And then, 4 years later, at the age of 20, that's when Josiah begins to purge Judah and Jerusalem of all forms of paganism, I'll let you read the details in 2 Chronicles 34, 3 through 7, even extending the reform into Assyrian-held territories, formerly known as Israel, according to 2 Chronicles 34, 6. So we have these early, almost Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20 type of reforms going on against the extreme paganism of the land. The next precipitating event, and this is how it helps us to locate Zephaniah the prophet in history. 12 years into his reign, I was going to say 12 years into his reign, Josiah begins his reforms, and this is before the death of Ashurbanipal. And we've got 6 years after he begins his reforms. That's when, 6 years in, is when the book of the law, according to 2 Kings 22, was discovered. And that was in 622 BC. This book of the law, or the book of Torah, probably a large portion of the book of Deuteronomy, is going to become the document behind the reform, and Zephaniah the prophet is going to now be working hand in hand with Josiah, probably also concurrently with Jeremiah. And all of this activity is about the spiritual reforms to support Josiah's reform efforts. So while Josiah is demonstrating tremendous faith to bring about politically motivated and led spiritual reform, we've got prophetic support in Zephaniah and also Jeremiah, but we're going to focus on Zephaniah with regards to some of the text that speaks to this. So just about the time that Zephaniah begins his prophet-led spiritual reforms, we've got Nineveh is being sieged at the hands of the Babylonians, the Battle of Carchemish in 612 BC. And not only that, we've got the tragedy that Josiah as king was when he was battling the Egyptians at the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BC, just 3 years later. Josiah is tragically killed in battle. So what happens after that? What happens after that is tragically a spiritual decline, spiral downward, and we've got Amanda Bynes representing the spiral downward in terms of her pictures from good, bad to worse. But we'll come back to this, and when we talk about Habakkuk next week. And locating Habakkuk basically happens after Josiah, and the series of kings after that leading up to the fall of Jerusalem. Habakkuk the prophet is active as a prophet, and he is looking in from his watchtower, and in the distance, divinely inspired, he sees the Babylonians coming across the sands, coming down from the north, and of course the Babylonians will be God's instrument, and basically God's plan A for the exilic experience that's due the majority in Judah and in Jerusalem. So we'll talk about that more next week. So we go to the text of Nahum in chapter 1. You can read in the very first one. The translation's oftentimes the word oracle, but that word literally in Hebrew is more about the idea of a burden. And we've got this prophetic burden idea coming in, just like the guy carrying this pack kind of weighing down. That would be hard on one's neck, but we talked about in survey, that idea of the Hebrew word for prophet means literally to bubble forth. And if you shake up a Coke can, carbonated beverage bottle or whatever, you've got this buildup. It's got to go somewhere. And that's the idea of a prophet. Nahum is getting this, not only is he a fugitive, he's got this politically incorrect message of treason, but he's got to speak to a hard-hearted and hard-of-hearing audience about their spiritual problem. Now we have the contrast with Nahum and a similar prophet that was raised by God to go to Nineveh, and that's Jonah. Just 100 years before, we've got this message there of repentance and grace, and there's a beginnings of what happens there as we've already looked at the book of Jonah. So now we are 100 years down the road in history, and we meet up with a different Nineveh, an Assyria that's become very brutal and very good at conquering nations. And their tactics were well known nationally. It's brutal. in terms of war crimes and all of the things. So Nahum is speaking to Judah about the brutality of the Assyrians and their eventual fall. Now, on one hand, um, Judah would have stood up and cheered. Well, that's exactly what they want to have happen, God's judgment against them. But then the message starts to turn and suggest that it might be that it's Judah in the south, in Jerusalem, that's got a spiritual problem that, if not addressed, the same thing that happened to Israel in the north could very well happen to them as well. And that God may just well allow that to happen because they're spiritually have gotten to be no better off than their neighbors to the north in Israel. I mean, you've got the idea there in verse 2, if you read it, the idea that God is jealous and he's an avenging God. Well, you know, like this picture, you've got to ask yourself the question, what is he jealous over? And in the notes here, I've given you some references to Exodus 20, verse 5. And if you look in Exodus chapter 34, verse 14, you get the full spectrum of all of the descriptions of who God is. He's long-suffering, he's gracious. The idea of him also being a God of justice, a God who's wrathful, and a jealous God. All you know, and that's the thing about these prophets is that they're reading they're well versed in their Old Testament theology of who God is. As a nation, they have a track record of experiencing who God is. The fact that God is jealous, but in Exodus 34, 1 through 9, you read that one and you get the full spectrum of who God is and how he responds to his people. But there's one passage in Exodus 19, there in verses 1 through 5, specifically verse 4 there, and that's the idea that God, and that's the context there, is Sinai. This will come back in the message of Zephaniah, so I want to pick up with it here. God's jealous over his segulah, and that's that word that's translated special prized possession there in verse 4. God is jealous. He's declared his nation as his most valued prized possession, and it is an object of his love, more than and above, over and above all of the other nations. You might say that Israel had that special election status because God chose them as a nation. And within that, of course, we have to keep track of the righteous remnant, the faithful remnant, and by the time that we meet up with Judah in the historical context of the prophet Nahum, we have to recognize that a majority of Israel and the nation of Judah has gotten sidetracked with regards to idolatry and some of these pagan practices. So God is jealous over the destruction and the tarnishing of his segulah, whether it be from pressures from without or from pressures and decay from within. God is still jealous over that segulah, and he wants that segulah to emerge in its proper designation down the road, and we'll see in Zephaniah how that's going to happen. But here in the early text here, we see an emphasis on, in the more literal translation here, I've given you a God of jealousy, and one who takes vengeance is Yahweh. And one who takes vengeance is Yahweh, a master of wrath. And oh, by the way, if you haven't heard it the first two times, one who takes vengeance is Yahweh towards his adversaries, and he reserves wrath for his enemies. Yahweh, who is he? It's the language of Exodus 34. Long-suffering in anger, great in strength, and by no means will he clear the guilty. Yahweh, who is he and how does he operate? In whirlwind and in storm is his way, and clouds are the dust of his feet. So you see this emphasis, so it's out of the outer workings of the language of Exodus 34:6, for example, that we see being worked out here. Not only do we see gracious patience, remember 100 years from Jonah to Nahum, it's a long time of being patient, almost like that time that Noah took to build the ark. I haven't seen the new movie yet. I hope it's good. I know they took a little creative liberty with all the time that Noah was building the ark, but it's probably not too far off if the people around are presented as being pagan. But anyway, from that 100-year period from Jonah to Nahum, we've got this 100 years of the message of Jonah to settle in. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. And the people of Nineveh turn into a downward spiral, becoming really good at being a bloodthirsty nation. We'll see in the language coming up. Beginning in verse 4, we're going to see that the prophet speaks in language that refers to God's sovereignty over some of the major getting your attention kind of events that happen in observable nature, such as seas being dried up, rivers being made dry, the languishing of vineyard-type flourishing areas such as Bashan and Carmel, Lebanon, the fruit of Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon being languishing. Those are the huge forests with the old-growth trees. Then you've got references to mountains quaking, hills melting, earths heaving, the world and all of its inhabitants. So it's this, all the context for what Nahum is going to share and unpack is woven into the very sovereignty of God's rulership over not just nations, but with all aspects of creation. And the question that is asked in verse 6 is a rhetorical question. Before this indignation, or before his divine vengeance, who shall stand? Of course, the answer is no one. And if you don't want to watch the video clip I've given you, a video clip of a tsunami that comes in, and it's kind of intense, so just be prepared. But it's the kind of thing, well, who can stand against something that comes out of nowhere, like a tornado? I was watching some new Netflix. There's a new Netflix video out on the tornado season of 2011. It's kind of cool if you're into tornadoes. It's another example. Who can stand? There's some video footage. And the answer is, of course, nothing. Nobody can stand unless you get in a tightly sealed basement if you've got a class 5 tornado coming at you. Or the flash fires of West Texas that come through very quickly. There's a real-time elapse scene right there to show you how quickly those fires move across West Texas when the fierceness of God's fury is compared to a flash fire like that what we see in Texas. But right in the middle of the focus that the prophet gives on God's fierce anger, we see this breath of fresh air that I think the prophet turns from the majority of the folks in the room who are part of the rebellious majority. He turns to the faithful remnant sitting on the far right hand corner in the back. Verse 7, good is Yahweh, a refuge in the day of adversity, and he knows those who seek shelter in him. So this now attention turns to the remnant. So there's one group within Judah that's asking the right questions in the midst all of that's going on in Nahum's day, post-Sennacherib crisis. They want to know, is God given up on us yet? Is there still a good God who, while he'll need to judge the nations, while he may need to judge us too, but what about his justice, and how is that going to be worked out in our situation? So that's the difficulty that the prophet has in addressing the real questions from the faithful remnant. Of course, you've got Habakkuk. We'll talk about that next week, but you've got the famous verse that addressed that question for the prophets of church history. Martin Luther, John Calvin, the authors of a lot of the New Testament, Paul, and the author of Hebrews and James, were all talking about salvation by faith plus nothing. And where do they go and quote Habakkuk 2:4? The just shall live by means of their faith. Of course, Habakkuk is dealing with the situation much like Nahum. Spiritual chaos, the looming threat of the Babylonians. What do the righteous remnant do? Well, they stand firm. Kind of like the goats in this picture, and I'll let you watch that on your own, but they're the ones that are within view of Jerusalem on the higher mountain areas and the hills, and they're the goats specifically designed. They're the ones with the hinds feet for high places, and that's in Habakkuk 3:16 and following. It's a great image of what the faithful do amidst the adversity that sometimes comes their way, and sometimes because of God's sovereignty and his agenda for the particular situation. They're hopping all around, as you know in the video. You can watch it. The babies are chasing each other as if nothing is going on. but they're all hopping around on these very sharp crags within the mountains and leaping around because of their specifically perfectly designed hinds feet, perfectly designed for that particular maneuvering without being harmed. So there's something to be said there. So we get to passages, and I move ahead now. We're going to have to skip around a little bit here. Chapter 1, verse 12, for example, though they are complete. Now, here the prophet Nahum is addressing Nineveh and Assyria. He's speaking to them, but within the audience that he has of Judah. Judah is in a way invited to listen in on a conversation that Nahum is having against Nineveh. And they're complete. Of course, that they're at their heyday. Again, we're at chapter 1, verse 12. And also numerous, yet they shall be mowed down, and he shall pass over them. And it's interesting, of course, 100 years has passed from the time of Jonah and his prophecy. But what's interesting is 300 years after Nahum's prophecy, we've got a record from a Greek military commander, Xenophon. He was also one of the students of Socrates. While in full retreat from the Peloponnesian War, he led his army over the once known site of the city of Nineveh, and in his historical records, his quiet time journal or thought journal, he does not even mention anything about Nineveh, almost as if it was entirely not even recognizable. So that's interesting. And here we have chapter 1, verse 14. Yahweh's given command concerning you. So the question is, what is that command? None shall be sown, bearing your name again. From the house of your gods I shall cut off graven and molten image. I shall dig your grave, for you have no significance. Which is them's fighting words if you're an Assyrian king hearing this coming from the prophet Nahum. Of course, the king in reference here would be Ashurbanipal, Assyria's last great king. Of course, any good Assyrian king would have prayed for his son to come along, or to be sown, to bear his name and carry that name, that reputation of the dynasty. They would write inscriptions on the temple walls in commemoration and to pay memorial and tribute to the deceased king or father. But as it stands, Yahweh has other plans for the king and the cone of shame. God's plan for the Assyrian king is the cone of shame. God promises that a son or successor will not come. 2, God will cut down the images and forms of the Assyrian gods in the temple. So that's going to not only extend shame to the king, but it's also going to extend shame to the Assyrian gods, as if they even existed. And then thirdly, God will have the grave dug for the king, but it's going to be an unmarked grave of no significance. So that means that Assyrians' enemies will dig the grave for the king after military defeat. So if you're Nahum preaching that message in the First Baptist Church of Jerusalem, you're probably going to get thrown in jail after that. That's treason. And Manasseh would not have liked that kind of idea getting out to the Assyrian overseers of his day, especially if they were overhearing and listening. This would have gotten the king in hot water really quick. So Nahum is probably at this stage in his prophetic career running for his life, like the picture in the movie that we have here. And not only that, there's the pressure for Nahum. Of course, if none of this comes true, if Nineveh doesn't fall, then Nahum's pretty much going to have his head on the chopping block, because he's going to be a false prophet, according to Deuteronomy 18:20-22. So as we move into chapter 2, we're going to see some details showing up as the prophet Nahum speaks in great details about the coming armies. Described here, the shields of his mighty men are red, men of strength are scarlet clad, flashing with metal is the chariot in his day of readiness. And it's like, you can watch this video here, and there's a modern version of the chariots here. You've got these description of the coming army dressed in red as a means of intimidating the defensive army. And we do that too, and pretty intense if you see a bunch of tanks coming at you, for example. And in chapter 2, verse 4, we have the chariots racing madly in the streets, rushing wildly in the squares. Their appearance is like torches. They dash to and fro like lightning flashes. And then in the midst of all of that, in verse 5, it's almost like an ironic commentary. The prophet Nahum speaks with regards to the he here, his reference to the Assyrian king. What's the king doing? He remembers his noble ones as if he forgot. And then he issues the battle cry, summoning his noble ones, his military commanders, to lead the troops into defensive array. But in the process, they stumble and they're going, and they hasten to her wall, all to find out that the siege covering has already been prepared. What is this siege covering? I'll just give you a few examples and a few ideas of siege equipment that has been designed and been around for some time. But you've got all these protective coverings to protect the siege soldiers who are doing a number of different things, whether they're getting close to the wall, whether they're trying to batter down the front gate of the walled city, or just defensive positions. But all of these things are the covering referred to here in verse 5 there. That's where we are in chapter 2, verse 5. In verse 6, the gates of the rivers are opened and the palace or temple is dissolved or melted. The idea here, it's interesting that Nineveh, according to this map here, is right off the Tigris River, and on the edge and right in the middle of this pink area, which would have been the flood zone that we have historical evidence of. Probably like any city near a large river that has a tendency to have major floods, like we call them with the Mississippi River, right? We call them the 100-year floods. There would have been a series of dikes and levees probably built in and around Nineveh to protect against the floodwaters. And it's interesting what's being referred to here. The gates of the rivers are opened. The Greek historian, we have extra biblical evidence from Diodorus Siculus, who writes about the fall of Nineveh in history, and he reports that a series of rains had swelled the Tigris and literally flooded a portion of the city, causing a caving in of about a 2-mile length of the city walls. Of course, for the Babylonians, that would have been good news indeed, because floodwaters would have worked in their advantage. It could have very well been also that the Babylonians had a way of attacking those levees and breaking them and causing the floodwaters to come in and weaken the walled city of Nineveh as well. So either or, we've got the reference there in verse 6 to the working of water in the advantage of the attacking army, the Babylonians. And here you've got the strong language here in verse 7. It's settled, she's stripped, that is the city, she's carried away. So the Babylonians would have taken the Assyrians captive, just like they had done themselves for so many of their opponents. Now we've got a turning around of events, and her handmaids, the moaning of voices of doves, smiting on their breasts. You've got this grieving and this mourning going on as the captives are being taken away in a chain. Of course, this is one of the Assyrian kings here. This was actually, ironically, one of the images that was representing the fall of Samaria in 722. Of course, I remind us of this slide in terms, and just to remind ourselves of where the brutality of Assyria had gone, kind of a downward spiral. More and more, we'll have some words about this in just a second, but more and more brutal Assyria had become with regards to her military tactics. And you've got some of this sheer terror that's going on in chapter 2, verse 10, with regards to the fall of Nineveh. And you've got, in the Hebrew, there's words that in this case are all rhyming and sounding alike, and it's just a way, even in the language, as Nahum is perhaps preaching this message, would have even brought about the sense of panic, destruction, devastation, decimation. And then you've got the bodily response to the news of Nineveh's fall. And the heart melts, and the knees, they totter. And what about the loins? They convulse, that tightening of the gut. What about the face? It becomes pale. So this sense of terror is what's being communicated here in the words of the prophet Nahum. And I'll let you read about the commentary on the lions on your own, but we get to Nahum chapter 3, and now I've got an interesting, every now and then I break out in professor's song and give you my own spin on some things. So I'm deviating a little bit from some of the commentaries that you're maybe used to reading for the prophet Nahum on some of the strong language that we see here. I've got a theory on some things. And the first, with regards to chapter 3, verse 1, so you've got this reference to bloodthirsty city, and then Nahum says very strongly, the whole thing lives a lie. What do? Why are they living a lie? They profiteer. Their profiteering is incessant. They're profiting on the fact of their military exploits, which have gotten very violent. So the reference there to bloodthirsty. Bloodthirsty city. And their victimizing will never be eliminated unless, of course, God himself steps in on the back or on the foundation of his sovereignty. And my theory on this is this idea, we see this in the history of nations, the rising and the fall of nations. And you've got this, Nineveh has become a city that cannot stop from being a victimizer of the innocent. Their expression of sinful humanity almost goes back to the time of, maybe even surpasses the time of the Tower of Babel. And what does God do against this cooperative but yet extremely rebellious group of sinful humanity? Like at Babel, he'll confuse and he'll scatter. And if you think of ancient cities or civilizations where the brutality of the human being becomes almost like a sport, or almost, I would say in the case of all of them, almost like a religion, a celebrated expression of the collective IQ of the nation. You see people standing up like this scene from the movie, not Braveheart, but Gladiator, the reference to people when they stand up and cheer this kind of thing. You've got the image of God in humanity being devalued to the extreme. And you can watch the scene here from the movie Gladiator on your own, but you see the prophet Nahum calling Nineveh a city of blood, the bloodthirsty city, because I would argue that behind any of these concentrated expressions of sinful humanity, where there's brutality against other human beings, you probably have a satanic stronghold behind all of it. And so we get back to Genesis 3:15 and this cosmic battle that's probably going on over various times in history, where God knows when the time is up on the satanic stronghold. And when God pulls and calls that card, he's going to bring about the change, the transformation. He's going to put everything to a stop. So the wheels of the Assyrian brutality against humanity is coming to a screeching halt. And that's what happens in the history and the rise and fall of nations. And in contrast, and of course one of those nations that was responsible for extreme brutality against humanity was the Nazis in World War II. And here's a classic scene from the movie Schindler's List, Oskar Schindler. And when the Jews come along and to say thank you to him in a very moving scene at the train station, Oskar Schindler recognizes the value of the human being. It's more than just dollars and cents in monetary value. But I'll let you watch that on your own. But you got chapter 3, verse 2 continuing on with the details with regards to the war machine, the Babylonians, the crack of whip, rumble of wheel, steel, rearing, chariot lurching, horsemen charging with flash of sword and glitter of spear, casualties countless, heaps of carcasses, endless corpses, so much so that they'll stumble over their corpses. And this is the kind of language that we see. And we've got our own evidence of this kind of war that happens in the horrors of war, and you've got soldiers dying over their own dead, and this is the kind of thing that we see going on. And it's no surprise that you probably, here in the description, in chapter 3, verse 4, you've got references to witchcraft. Of course, I've already given you my theory of the satanic stronghold. So behind the brutality of a nation, it's no surprise that Nahum also addresses Nineveh as a city of whores, as a city of witches, and all of this kind of occult activities also present in and around the area of Nineveh. And it's interesting, extra outside of the Bible, archaeology has unearthed, literally in the formerly known site of the city of Nineveh, thousands of tablets, small little tablets, and on them they reveal a very intense concentration of sorcery and magic that was apparently permeating the Assyrian culture. What was written on these tablets were short incantations for magic and spells and this kind of thing. So it just seems that as if this kind of concentrated expression of rebellion comes from a hotbed of satanic activity. But if Satan unearths his army, God has just as well the upper hand to bring about the opposing armies. And you continue in verse 7 to see in chapter 3 the strong words of the prophets. So be it. He's declaring this thing as a done deal because God's behind it. Everyone who sees you will flee from you and will say, quote, devastated is Nineveh. Who will grieve for her? Where can I find comforters for you? And interesting, I've got a short video clip here of it's common in certain Asian cultures and around the world to hire professional mourners for, like, say, a very public funeral that you'd have in full public view. And the idea of a paid mourner or professional mourner was to attract more people to come to your funeral. And here Nahum is saying that I can't even find and hire a professional mourner to come to the funeral of Nineveh. In fact, if we jump over to chapter 3, verse 18, he's calling for the leadership of Assyria. They're sleeping. Their nobles are lying down. And while the people are scattered on the mountains, and there's no one to regather them, there is no relief for your breakdown. Your wound is incurable, the prophet says in verse 19. All who hear about you will clap their hands over you. For on whom has not your evil passed continually? Question. And what's interesting about this is that not only do you have the applause, I guess that's the last verse there, not only do you have the applause of the nations over the demise of the city of Nineveh, the reason for their applause is the extreme cruelty of the Assyrians, and all of the nations would have known and applauded their eventual destruction. But again, not without the grace, because you've got the contrast of how the book of Jonah ends with a question. Remember, there's only 2 books in the Old Testament that end with a question, Jonah and Nahum. And that sets up the contrast between the grace that was demonstrated by God at the end of Jonah with the question, and the last question of the book of Nahum also addresses the destruction of Nineveh as an extension of God's judgment against them. But in between, of course, you've got sandwiched in between those 2 bookends 100 years of time. And that's the long suffering, or the grace, the patience of God, you might say, with regards to what will happen. But it also points us to the grace that was demonstrated to us at the cross. This would be a great jump ahead. Of course, we have that place where it reminds us of God's great grace and His mercy, that He demonstrates to us that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So there we have the New Testament connection. Now we must press on the book of Zephaniah, and if you read the very first verse, you see the pedigree of the prophet Zephaniah. He's going to have a great grandfather who's well known, aka Hezekiah, one of the last great reforming kings of the history of Judah. So we're going to have a kind of a connection from Hezekiah to Josiah and the prophet Zephaniah. Um, all of this is significant because we have the book of the Torah being discovered behind the temple wall in 622 during the time of Josiah. Of course, we already talked about the fact that Josiah's reform efforts had already begun. Then they discover the book of the law. Right on the top of that, we place Zephaniah in the beginning of his prophetic ministry. So he's going to tag team with the king, Josiah, in bringing about, hopefully, the proper heart change necessary for a real, true reform to take place. Zephaniah is going to be just like the courtroom lawyer, and he's going to be he's got Judah on the defense stand. He's the prosecuting attorney. His law book is, of course, the book of Deuteronomy, and you see a lot of comparisons. I'll let you look at a lot of these on your own, but when Zephaniah pulls a reference or an attack, it's always with regards to covenant relationship is the violation, and he goes back to places like Deuteronomy 28 and chapter 4 and chapter 32, and some of these places that emphasize the curse side of covenant relationship, what God will do to remove covenant blessings in response to the rebellion of God's people. Now this picture, and I'll let you watch this video on your own, the bulldozer represents the political side of reform. Of course, that's what Josiah is doing. Please read 2 Kings 23, verse 4 and following to get an idea of the hard work that King Josiah had already begun before Josiah comes along. So tearing down the temples to Baal, I call them the International House of Baal, or the IHOBs. All of them are being torn down. Zephaniah comes along and gives the theological basis for the reform, with the call to repentance and the hope for the change of heart. And you see here in verses 2 through 3 the strong language and the idea of wiping out birds, sea, fish. And, this is a return to, you might think there's a language that's being used here that's reminiscent of Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 7, and then through chapter 8. It's the flood language that we are reminded of. And what's interesting is, at the end of the flood account in chapter 8, verse 21 in Genesis, didn't God promise not to ever do this again? That would have been obviously a logical question for Zephaniah's audience. And the answer is yes, but I think what we have to do is stay close to the idea that the references that we have in Zephaniah and this, the idea of the fish and what's being removed, birds of the sky, fish of the sea, I think is a subtle reference to the idolatry that would have been very prevalent in Zephaniah's day. As part of the reform, Zephaniah is calling into question the idols, the kinds of idols that oftentimes come from nature, right? The worship of fish, the worship of birds, the worship of rocks and trees, and all of this pagan idolatry. That's the thing that's going to be blotted out. So it's kind of an interesting, not wordplay, but what the prophet's doing is building on the common knowledge of what did God do then and what is he going to do now. It's kind of like what he did in Genesis, but what's being blotted out are the idols that Jerusalem and Judah had brought in through the pagan influence. Now, interestingly, they become stumbling blocks in verse 3. Stumbling blocks in other contexts in Scripture are oftentimes referred to as idols, stumbling blocks. So I think that's why I've got a good case to make. In other words, why I think I'm right in my interpretation of this. I think we can go to places like Jeremiah chapter 6, verses 16 through 20, to have some other places where prophets refer to stumbling blocks as idols and God's judgment against those kinds of things. And another reason why I think I'm right is with regards to just verse 4, we're going to continue on into the prophet Nahum's laundry list of, you might say, to-do list with regards to the idolatry or the paganism of the times. And here you've got an A, B, C, D, and E, and F itemization of the kinds of things that need to be blotted out or removed from the very place. So you have in verses 4 and 5 a list. The remnant of Baal. Then you've got the name of the pagan priests, the Chemarim. Those are the pagan priests. And then the third item is those who worship the host of heaven on rooftops, the astrology, the people who are conversing with the astrology charts and all of those things. The fourth thing, those who worship by swearing to Yahweh while swearing to your translation might say Moloch, might be swearing to Moloch or any other pagan king instead of the exclusive loyalty that's called for by God himself. Those who turn back from following after Yahweh, and those who do not even seek Yahweh and do not even inquire of him. That, aka, those who have completely forgotten God. All of these things are being alluded to and referred to in Nahum's house cleaning list, you might say. So we've got the full gambit of the astrology and the horoscope and the swearing by false gods, and then what Moses had ultimately kind of warned against in Deuteronomy 7 verses 1 through 6. If you've turned and you don't seek and don't even inquire, you've forgotten God. You've forgotten Yahweh. Almost we have a Romans chapter 3 verses 9 through 19 situation here with regards to pagan idolatry. So in response, Zephaniah calls for a shh moment with regards to Judah, their syncretism, and all that they're about doing with regards to paganism. The only thing that's left to announce is a day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is going to be the central theme of the prophet Zephaniah. And depending on the audience, the day of the Lord can mean either judgment or can mean good news, something to hold out for, something to sink your faith teeth into, so to speak. So this is the primary day that Zephaniah, as the prophet, is going to unpack for his audience. And in verse 7, you've got the preparation of a sacrifice being referred to, and the consecration of the guests who are being invited to an event. What is that event? It's the day of the Lord, which Zephaniah grounds firmly into the day of the covenant for him. It's going to build on, it's going to be the fulfillment of all of the covenants that have been promised in the past. Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, and the new covenant of Jeremiah all are probably in view here with regards to this coming day of the Lord. It's going to be a day when the sacrifice is prepared, the guests are consecrated, and the focus is on the covenant ceremony. However, for some, the day of the Lord for Zephaniah is a day of judgment. It'll be a call to repentance, and you see the parallels there to Matthew chapter 3 verses 1 through 12, Luke chapter 3 verses 1 through 18. So you see some parallels to the Zephaniah's emphasis on the covenant ceremony aspects with regards to Christ himself in Matthew 26 through 29, with regards to the day of the covenant, or the covenant meal, that Last Supper, right, event for Christ and his disciples. Now I've got an interesting little discussion here on verses 8 and 9 in chapter 1 with regards to the day of the Lord. On the day of sacrifice of Yahweh, of the Lord, what will happen? Well, there'll be divine punishment inflicted against the leaders, against the sons of the king. Of course, these would have come after Josiah. On all who are clothed with foreign garments, those who are the priests, who are dressing up as pagan priests to Baal. And I've given you some references to that. And then this interesting reference here, all inflict punishment on all those who leap over the threshold, who will fill the house of their lords with violence and deceit. Now that reference to leaping over the threshold comes from the pagan idea of all things. You can watch the video that I've got here, the idea of breaking your mama's back, step on a crack. The reason why you have to leap over the crack or leap over the threshold or the entrance of a pagan temple so that you don't offend the gods of that temple. So that's where we get the idea, break your mama's back, step on a crack, according to the famous Devo song. Watch it in the video and have a flash from the past. You also have an Old Testament reference in 1 Samuel 5:5 to it. But the irony here for the prophet Zephaniah is that his audience is much more concerned about proper pagan worship as they are proper worship of Yahweh when they go to the temple. So it's just an interesting bit of irony there. So as we continue down that vein of Zephaniah's introduction of the day of the Lord, in verse 15, for example, in chapter 1, a day of overflowing wrath is that day. So now he's, Zephaniah is speaking to the majority of unfaithful in Jerusalem, First Baptist Church of Jerusalem, a day. What's the day like, they ask. Now the Hebrew is interesting because you've got the first Hebrew word followed by a similar Hebrew word, but more intense. So it's a day of adversity and of great adversity or distress, a day of destruction, well, even more intense, a day of desolation, a day of darkness. Not only just that, it's a day of thick darkness, a day of cloud. Not only that, it's a day of thick cloud, a trumpet blast. So that's the sound that you hear from a distance when the opposing army is coming in to announce their presence. But it's even more intense than that. You've got the battle shout, where the army gets right up in your face and does all of the things to try to intimidate you. Not only battle shouts, they've got the pounding of their swords against their shields, and if you watch the movie Braveheart, the lifting of the skirts, which is all as a means of intimidating your enemy, the attacking army, so to speak. So all of this is what the prophet Zephaniah is describing here with regards to this day of the Lord. And in verse 7, you've got kind of a Big Mac sandwich construction in the Hebrew with regards to the bread, the outside slices of bread. But right in the middle, you've got the covenant charge against the guilty in Judah. For against Yahweh they have sinned. And I will bring distress on men, and they will walk as blind men. That's the futility. God will ramp up futility against the guilty. Then you've got this bottom part of the sandwich here. The blood shall be poured out as dust, and in their entrails as dung. It sounds a very kind of vicious and kind of almost bloodthirsty, bloodlust kind of idea. And that's interestingly one of the words that Richard Dawkins uses, but we have to correct Richard Dawkins because I don't think that's the idea behind this at all. And if you go to this slide and read Exodus 24, 1 through 8, what's interesting there, and what I think is really in view here from the prophet Nahum, if you look, what's really way of describing something as having no value at all in the Hebrew, it's comparing it to dust. Or if you're going to talk about something in Hebrew that you're going to describe it as something as somewhat offensive, you're going to refer to it as dung. What's interesting, the prophet Zephaniah describes the wedding day ceremony, the covenant day ceremony for Israel with regards to the pouring out of blood. And there was a time when blood had extreme value and worth, contrary to dust, or contrary to dung. It wasn't offensive, and it was of great value. Well, in the context of a day of the covenant ceremony, the wedding day, back in Exodus 24, in the context there is the day Sinai, Mount Sinai event. You've got the wedding day, the exchange of words, and then you've got the covenant ceremony, which involved the bringing of the sacrifices. And if you read the text, the pouring of blood out, and then the sprinkling of the blood on the people. And that's not an example of when blood was like dust and of no value, or was offensive. But what the prophet is saying is that they have gotten and turned that event into an event that is of great offense and of great little value to God. They've turned that ceremony, that covenant day ceremony, into, so what the prophet Zephaniah is saying, there'll be a day when everything will be reversed, and that day will be a day of great value, unlike the day that you've turned it into, Judah. But in the midst of all of this, the prophet Zephaniah in chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, the call to the altar call is given. Before the decree takes effect, there's still time, in other words. The day's coming, verse 2, the day passes like the chaff before the burning anger of the Lord comes upon you. Before the day of the Lord's anger comes upon you. What is it? Seek the Lord. All of you who are humble on the earth or land, who have carried out his ordinances or statutes, seek righteousness. Those of you who are seeking righteousness or seeking humility, those of you I call to seek the Lord. Perhaps the prophet says, you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. And it's interesting, if you're looking or studying the organization of Zephaniah's sermon, the call to gather comes first, and then before. Notice the structure here. Before, seek. Then the altar call is the altar's made open to all who are all who are meek of the land, who do justice, who seek righteousness, who seek meekness. And then the promise, perhaps, that the Lord will overlook or pass over in his day of wrath. And of course he will. That's what he does in response to the remnant, the righteous remnant. And I know I've given you some other slides there. I'm just, for the sake of time, I'm a little long-winded on both of these prophets, and I was in class, so you just have to bear with me. We'll move to chapter 3 in Zephaniah and get to the punchline, because there's some pretty significant theology that comes out at the very end here as his prophetic means of encouraging the remnant. And we start in chapter 3, verse 8, where it's interesting what the prophet does and what the Lord will do on this day of the Lord is call the nations to witness and hear the testimony against, with regards to the covenant violation, against God's people. And then what we see is an interesting turn of events. While that doesn't stop the divine judgment against the nations, in verse 8 you see that, but then in verse 9 we have an interesting turn of events. What is the impact of the day of the Lord for the nations? And what's interesting, you see this language in verse 9. I will give to the peoples, the idea, he'll call the nations together, and then over their transformation he will give the peoples purified lips. Why? So that they may call on the name of the Lord. And then the language is to serve him shoulder to shoulder. Now let's just kind of talk about that for a second. Calling on the name of the Lord is entering into the covenant community, and then serving shoulder to shoulder or single shoulder really is identifying of a single group of faithful. So it's interesting, the remnant is addressed here in the way that serving with the remnant of the Jews will be those coming from the nations. So we've got this one program, divine program for a single people, namely the remnant. And that's significant, because the day of the Lord, when it comes, it will eventually come and involve all nations and all faithful from wherever they are, scattered from all of the nations of the earth, being brought together as a single remnant, serving hand in hand. The activity of the day of the Lord, single offering that will be brought to the Lord on this day, will be coming from all of these peoples as one. And where will they come from? Verse 10 tells us, well, one example is from beyond the rivers from Ethiopia. My worshipers, my dispersed ones, they'll bring my offerings. So they're coming from all destinations, north, south, east, and west. Now what will happen to this remnant? In verse 11 we start to see the details. In that day, you, that is the faithful remnant, will feel no shame, because of all your deeds by which you have rebelled against me. For then I will remove them from your midst, your proud, exalted ones, and you will never again be haughty on my holy mountain. So the day of the Lord will be a day of no shame. You biblical counselors will have no jobs in this time. All the psychological effects of sin and shame will be gone. There'll be a place of no pride, pure humility. The day of the Lord, verse 12, will be a day described as humble and poor, those who are always seeking deliverance in the Lord. That'll be fulfilled. Verse 13, the remnant will not be speaking evil or deceit, and like a flock of sheep, they'll feed and lie down. Verse 13. I may not have read that verse yet. The remnant of Israel will do no wrong, tell no lies, nor will a deceitful tongue be found in their mouths, for they shall feed and lie down, with no one to make them tremble. And that's the language that comes out of Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. You can refer to that, and the lion and the lamb laying down together. It'll be a time of rest for God's people, an extension of, you might say, fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, reference to rest in 2 Samuel 7:7, and also in Psalm 78, verse 71. There'll be a fulfillment of this. And more importantly, probably the punchline for this, let's just look at the verses here in chapter 3, verse 15. There's a celebration, a shout for joy. Let me get to the reference here. Earlier I referred to the day of the Lord as a covenant meal, and here I've got the Last Supper, but then everything else and all the activity that's going on with regards to coming to the table of the King. You see in verse 14 the reference to sing, the verb shout and rejoice. The reasons are given in verse 15 for this celebration. Yahweh has removed the curse of sin and judgment. Yahweh has removed all of Israel's enemies, both earthly and spiritual, and Yahweh himself has sat down on his throne over his people. And then verse 16, we have a restatement of this reality. It is said, it will be said to Jerusalem in that day, don't be afraid, O Zion. Do not let your hands fall limp. Why? Why should there be no fear? Verse 17 says, Yahweh, your God, is in your midst. Who is he? He's a victorious warrior. He always fights for your side. He fights on the side of salvation. He will exult over you with joy. Now let me pause for a second, because what we've got next is, I would argue, is we've got the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. For God so loved the world. In fact, it's the hallmark card of love for the faithful remnant that the prophet Zephaniah pulls out of his back pocket and reads publicly in front of the First Baptist Church of Jerusalem. And in verse 17b, it's a love poem from God to his righteous remnant. And here we have 3 simple verses with 3 simple lines each. And I'll read it out of the Hebrew in translation. Here's what the Hebrew says. He will delight over you with joy. He will be quiet over you in his love. He will rejoice over you with singing. And every time you see the word you, write in your own name. We've got this poem that is a reaffirmation of the declaration that God made in Exodus 19:4 when he declares his segulah over his nation. That declaration, you are my most precious prized possession. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It's that declaration, the segulah, in Exodus 19:4. Now we have a full circle return to that kind of love language. Of course, we saw it acted out with the prophet Hosea in relationship with Gomer. God's love for his people, even despite themselves and even despite their seeming, we've got this rebellious activity, but yet we've got this love commitment of God to his remnant that he's wanting to come to bring about over you, over you, over you. God pursues us, and even despite ourselves. Here it is. It's kind of the Old Testament. God loves the sinner, but he sees the saint because he sees the saint. This kind of love language comes out of the nature of who God is. And we've seen this language described in God before, back in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. And here we have this promise of the extension of the Abrahamic covenant to the whole world, because now we know that this is the single shoulder declaration, this invitation to the whole world, that all nations Even beyond, according to verse 10, the rivers of Cush will come. All those, according to verse 9 in chapter 3 here, will come and call on the name of the Lord. This is a response to and in line with the very last words that we have in 2 Chronicles 36. That invitation, let them go up. Well, what are they doing? Verse 9 tells us in chapter 3. They're going to, with purified lips, call on the name of the Lord. Well, who's going to be doing this? Well, the faithful remnant. Who will constitute this faithful remnant? Jews and Gentiles combined. All right, that's my little response in regards to the more complicated discussion of covenant versus dispensational theology, and whatever you think of that. I think right here we've got a good response to that. So perhaps the progressive dispensationalists are right at the end, in the end, with regards to their emphasis on one program for one people. I do think they're right. I think it's about the remnant. So there you go. And Walter Kaiser is correct on that as well, just so you know what I think. So it's a great promise and a great reminder. In verse 18 you see everyone who's grieving properly with regards to the loss, when they get to Zion, what will he do? What will the Lord do? Behold, I am going to deal at that time with all your oppressors. I will save the lame, gather the outcast, and I will turn their shame into praise, and the word is name or reputation. So this is a part of the regathering of the remnant of faithful, will be the reestablishing of the name of Yahweh. And we have that coming again from Deuteronomy 30 verse 1 and 4, but it continues into the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7 verse 10. And in the place of shame and dishonor, God will restore both honor and name in fulfillment of Deuteronomy 26:19, Jeremiah 13:11. And that whole name theology stems all the way back to Genesis chapter 12 verse 2, 1 Samuel 18:30, 2 Samuel 7 and 9, and then chapter 8 verse 13, and then 2 Samuel 7:23. And if you've never watched my video clip on this, and it's just like this video clip if you've never seen it, the day of the Lord and his celebration emphasis that Zephaniah gives, I think it's a lot like what happens at the end of this video. And perhaps it's the activity that we see described during that time when Jesus comes back and establishes his rule during something called the millennial reign. Maybe it takes about 1,000 years to spin off before the establishment of the final new heavens and new earth. Just an idea. I'll let you sort out all the details on that. So I've gone way over time. Sorry for my long-windedness, but watch this video and get the Kleenex box.